Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 108, Elm Revisited. It's been a long time since we've had a discussion on Elm, or even transpilers, or I guess languages to JavaScript in general. Our guests today are Richard Feldman, who wrote the book Elm in Action, and Conner Ruhl. Is that correct? I work with you. I should know this.
Yeah, no problem. It's weird.
Yeah. On the panel, we have Justin, Danny, and myself. And so, Richard, you wrote the book Elm in Action. You did Elm Test, Elm CSS. You worked on the core for Elm Lang. And Conner, you've been working internally at Carfax, where I work as well. And you've been doing developer operations and working with Elm for internal apps, correct?
Yep.
Awesome. Can you guys, I guess starting with Richard, pretty much summary of what you've been doing with Elm, what's new lately?
I've been using Elm at work for side projects, for all sorts of stuff. For people who aren't familiar, Elm is a language that compiles to JavaScript. It has totally different semantics than JavaScript. So whereas like CoffeeScript or Babel, are sort of like very, very familiar if you're comfortable with JavaScript. Elm is its own language that's just totally independent that compiles to JavaScript so you can use it in the browser. And so we've been using it at work at NoRedInk for a little over a year now, coming up on a year and a half. And so far, we got almost 50,000 lines of Elm code in production. And since day one, we still have yet to have our Elm code throw one single runtime exception. So we have rollbar for tracking errors in the browser. We still get all sorts of errors from our legacy JavaScript code, but every single time, in that whole period that we've fixed one of those errors, the fix has always been changing JavaScript code. It's never been changing a line of Elm code for that. So obviously, we've been really happy with it. So as a result of that, we ended up hiring Evan Chaplicki, the creator of Elm, and he works with us now. By the way, we're hiring. And essentially, we've just been sort of like going full steam ahead, and now as much of our front end as possible is in Elm. We do all of our new stuff in Elm, and just looking forward to building out our app.
And that's something that I think is going to be, I think we're probably going to focus on quite a bit, because that's been like a big thing. People talking about Elm recently, and I think it's on the homepage of the website about no runtime errors, about being able to catch all this stuff at compile time. So I'm very interested to hear a bit more about that, especially as we go through as we get to talking about the compiler and things like that.
Yeah, it feels like a political campaign or something. You just can't believe it.
So what we've been using Elm for at Carfax, it has yet to see some massive adoption. Unfortunately, it's had to be contained to my team so far. And the reason it's on my team is there are three of us. So we use Elm for entirely different reasons. For us, it's less about runtime errors, although that's definitely a nice plus, but it's about more or less the ability to leave a project just for a long time, and then you come back to it and everything's just working. You're trying to make a change in a file that's relevant to the issue you're working on. And I'm in the view file for the services list. Okay, pretty much everything I'm going to need to know is right there. If I make changes or have to modify stuff, I can be really confident that the code I'm putting out will work correctly. And it means that we can do context switching just way easier for us three. So that ability has been driving a lot of our usage and exploration into Elm. And the mental model it puts you in is just something that helps us iterate quickly as a very small team who has to produce code that's correct, like from the start. So that's been our major driver in using Elm at Carfax. So there's a lot of teams using React at Carfax, and that's growing and cool. Maybe they'll try Elm at some point. That's exciting. But for internal apps and our DevOps stuff, I think we're pretty solidly sold on it and are working to grow our knowledge there and get better at it so we can just start really cranking out new tools for people. So that's been our major use case.
You bring up a good point, because we use a lot of React here at Carfax, and I recently heard JavaScript Jabber when Richard was on there. I think it was like It came out like last week or something, maybe a couple weeks. But anyway, it was interesting because there was talk about React and like, you know, why you would use React and Elm. And one of the things you talked about, Richard, was if you were a React developer and you went in and you tried to do Elm the way you do React, you would have a hell of a time. It would be really frustrating. And vice versa, if you tried to do, you know, React the way you would do Elm. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the basic idea there really has to do with state management. So React and Elm have one big thing in common, which is that they both use a virtual DOM. But as far as their ideas about state management, they're very different. So if you're familiar with React, it might be accurate to say if you were using flow for type checking and immutable JS for absolutely everything, as in like you only use it for everything is immutable the whole way, and you only ever use stateless components, then you're essentially going to most likely end up with something that is either exactly the Elm architecture or something that's very close to it. So where that name comes from is essentially, it's called the Elm architecture because it's sort of like, well, if you have only stateless functions, that is only pure functions and only immutable data and unidirectional data flow, you're probably going to end up with this architecture just pretty much organically. It takes sort of a mental model shift to work in that environment if you're used to React, which has, you know, sort of everything as a component. So imagine if you were in React and you were like, only use stateless components ever. And then you're like, oh, okay, so you mean only use stateless components 99% of the time. It's like, nope, literally 100% of the time. That's the only tool you have. It's just functions. There really essentially is nothing called a component. So people complain about Redux having boilerplate, right? People say like, Redux, I have to do all this stuff to express what I'm talking about. And part of that is just sort of innate to, look, if you want to be explicit about what each possible action, you know, that your application can do, there's no, you know, avoiding being explicit about it and writing it out. But another part of it is just the language itself. So Elm gives you some ways to express the same things more concisely than you can if you're using JavaScript and you have to make objects for every single action. Like union types, if you have those, which you do in Elm, you can be a lot more concise about those. But the main difference is the state management. If you're used to having a nested hierarchy of components, some of which may or may not be capable of managing their own state, and then you have a unidirectional data flow layered on top of that, it's sort of a different mental model than if you just have unidirectional data flow and that's it. You just have unidirectional data flow and functions. And yeah, I think this is changing now because we've sort of, like, as a community, started to figure out better how to transition people from the one mindset to the other. But definitely, like, the most common beginner mistake I've seen for a while was people sort of trying to do React state management story where you have sort of nested components and sort of apply that to Elm where you just literally do not have components, and like the word component is not, you know, a heading in any of the guide sections.
What I'm trying to think of is one of the first things that I had a lot of trouble with, and I'm even having a hard time asking the question, is that you did mention that Elm is a language, but it seems that it is also what we would think of as a framework. Like, there kind of seem to be two sides to that, because you just compared React, which is a framework, or library, whatever, to Elm, but Elm is a language. So can we, like, maybe just try to clarify, like, if there is a separation between the Elm language and the Elm, like, application architecture, or is it just one language that's made to build applications? I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, no problem. I was just going to say, I think this is something that kind of trips up people, at least the ones I've tried teaching to, is that fundamental, you are not writing JavaScript anymore. And so what really drove me to Elm at first was I thought Haskell was beautiful. All the ideas there excited me, but it was just utterly useless, and I couldn't get much stuff done. And when I looked at Elm, like later on, it had all the beauty of that language and just that mindset while presenting a way to get useful work out there. And so the language itself does a couple things like to your mental model. You stop basically considering as time as part of your applications. Writing stuff in a declarative fashion makes it so your code is far more gluable together. Refactors just happen sort of naturally as you go through it, and the type system itself just guides you towards really nice and reliable code. So those things are just sort of innate in the language itself. And when you kind of take out from the language immutability, these functions, and using them as your main tool, I think naturally, I can't say because I didn't invent it, but you'll end up, like what Richard was saying, sort of naturally toward the architecture. So there's a kind of a difference between the two. And you'll see some people writing really interesting things in just Elm itself without using like the main React use case too. So there's a lot of people writing games in interesting ways. It's kind of more open-ended in what you can accomplish. But there is that really nice mental model and framework you get with the Elm architecture for writing front-end web apps. So they're very related, but kind of two different categories of, I guess, concern.
Yeah, so I would say to be more concrete about it, it's that Elm is a language, but in practice, almost everybody uses it exactly the same way. So in JavaScript, you have the ability to write all of these different architectures. You can have React, you can have Vue, you can have jQuery style, you can have Angular style, Ember style, and there's just a big variety of ways that people are using it, and there's not a lot of consensus. In Elm, there is a lot of consensus. It's like, technically there are literally other ways you could do this, but the language, the design of the language sort of points you in this one direction and gives you the best tools to work in this direction. And so that's basically what everyone does. So although it's technically true that you can, it would feel like you're going way out of your way to try and do something different. Basically, almost no one does.
I just want to add one thing too about the language itself that I found while trying to teach it to people. When you start sort of with JavaScript or these imperative languages and try to copy the paradigms from there to Elm, it just gets kind of gross. And so a really concrete example of this we ran into the other day is while working on that resume that my friend is trying to build for himself in Elm. He had a list of tags and wanted to intersperse bullets between them, like in a header section. And so when you're used to JavaScript or that kind of language, your brain goes into, I need to build a loop here to iterate through. And on the last one, I'm not going to add a bullet point, right? Like that's sort of how you think of things as steps, right? Like it's sort of like following a recipe exactly down. And if you go out of order, there's a problem. Whereas the way Elm and other functional languages make you think is I want to transform my list of strings into a list of text items and use the intersperse function to drop some bullet points or a separator in there. So it was really interesting watching somebody try to write JavaScript essentially in Elm and naturally work themselves toward a pipeline style with very little effort, like just sort of their entire mind shift on how to deal with this iteration problem kind of shifted. And a lot of people I show the language at first get kind of weirded out by the syntax, I would say, and kind of the ML style of typing. And once you sort of work in it, and that's the most important thing I found, is just getting people to get in the language and get their hands dirty. A lot of these initial issues people have with the language itself just drop away really quickly. So yeah, that's been my experience in sort of trying to teach people how to get started with it, is that you'll see a lot of people trying to copy JavaScript to Elm directly or their existing paradigms, and that's where you really start running into just, oh, how do I do this? Well, you probably shouldn't. So,
okay, so just trying to wrap up real quick, so we don't, because we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about just this part. But so Elm itself is a language. It is not necessarily a framework, but this language gives you the ability to create applications with just using the language. So you could, I guess, if maybe the comparison would be if JavaScript itself was written in a way that was fast enough and clean enough that you didn't need other frameworks. If everybody, well, you don't even need them, but if everybody just agreed that this is how we build applications in vanilla JavaScript and that's it. And then Elm is just that layer on top of that makes a lot of stuff better, faster, cleaner. Is that fair?
Yeah, kind of. Right. It's essentially it's sort of like Elm the language, also the things that it ships with, like that make it particularly conducive to this. So one of the interesting differences between Elm and JavaScript is that Elm has the ability to sort of grow as a language while refactoring itself, while sort of like changing both by adding things and also by removing things. So JavaScript has this sort of legacy problem where you can't really take features out of JavaScript ever because you'd break the web, and that's not good. But Elm doesn't have that problem because Elm compiles to JavaScript. So every time Elm has released a new version of itself, a new release of Elm comes out, quite often it's taking things out. So just language features that were not used often, or that were confusing, or things like that. And so there's been this sort of intentional push towards, in very much the opposite way, where the JavaScript community has been sort of putting out more and more things, and just kind of people are sort of saying, okay, I have all these options. There's a million different alternatives out there. Which one should I pick? Elm's been more careful about saying okay, let's evaluate all these options. Let's do experiments, but then let's actually pick a way and focus on that. And I think the reason that it's had the ability to focus like this is because when new versions of Elm come out, the language itself can actually move towards embracing one particular way and sort of making that one use case as nice as possible, as opposed to JavaScript being more conducive to a billion different use cases are possible. They're all equally well supported. Go nuts, figure it out yourselves. Elm is a lot more about okay, this, the language's design seems to be pushing us in this direction. Let's embrace that. Let's run with that. Let's make it so that the tooling, the language features, the stuff the language ships with are the absolute nicest for this one use case. And that ends up, having the consequence that, yeah, pretty much everybody uses the same thing, and pretty much everybody's really happy with it. So that's it. Hopefully that clarifies.
Cool. Thank you.
Now that you've given developers everything they've ever wanted, do you find it's a lot of us get all crazy about these experiments, and we're like, oh, the new hotness, let's do this, let's do that, and there's all these problems. But it sounds like with Elm, it points to one way. You do this way very well, and there's a lot more time to do other things. I mean, you have even if you did have debugging, you needed to find out maybe when some code was introduced, not necessarily an error, but it sounds like you have tools similar to React, though, where there's a timeline tool, right, where you can go back and forth because of that one-way data flow. Is that correct?
Yeah, it started out sort of as an experiment. I heard about this at ElmConf, and then now there's a lot more sort of effort being poured into it. It appears to make that experience just really nice. And it's one of the things when I saw some of the people at Carfax were using Redux, and they've got that timeline debugger thing, and seeing that oh, I saw that a while ago. This isn't new.
Yeah.
You feel a little bit like a hipster sometimes when using Elm, but I mean, I've at several times felt like I've taken the jump on new technologies early, and they didn't pan out. But the thing that attracts me about Elm so much, and it's exactly what Richard was mentioning a moment ago, where the community takes a moment to sit back, evaluate how things are going, what's working well for people, what features do we need, what features don't we need, and takes the time to get it right. That's something that really inspires me to think the language is going somewhere awesome. I mean, I think that all the cool things in the front end sort of sphere are going to come out of some of the ideas we're seeing in Elm. They're just good ideas, and people are taking a good amount of time to evaluate and make it the best experience possible at every step of the process. So that alone just gives me the confidence I need to take on something as new as Elm, where it is pretty risky, I would say, for a organization to adopt technology that's as young as Elm. But then when you look at it and you start using it, you start realizing that, hey, it was riskier not to use this. So That's kind of the
Yeah,
experience
I
I've run
wonder
into.
how many large production applications out there that we could look at. Like, I wonder how many have moved over to Elm. I know that over at is it No Red Ink? Is that what it's?
Yep.
And No Red Ink, you guys have arguably the largest code base in Elm, from what I understand.
So it's funny. I always phrase it this way: we have the largest code base that we're aware of in Elm. But the thing is, I keep running into more people who are using Elm in production that we just have no idea about. So like ElmConf is a good example of this. So this just happened a couple weeks ago. It was like right before Strange Loop. It was sort of co-located, co-hosted with Strange Loop, and so we had a speaker dinner before that. And I went around, and of the 13 speakers, 7 of them, so slightly more than half, were using Elm in production. And basically, of those, like when I sat down, I had no idea that half of them were using Elm in production. And also 2 other speakers, I think, since that dinner are now using it in production. And it's just sort of one of those things where I'm just constantly surprised. Like, oh yeah, we have like 26,000 lines of Elm code in production. I'm like, whoa, where did you come from? And it's awesome. It's exciting. I heard there's this phenomenon that apparently languages have where once a language starts getting enough popularity that people start trying it out and people start doing stuff with it, they're using it, but they don't want to tell people about it because they feel like it's their secret weapon, and they don't want sort of the world to know. And then like later on, they're like, ta-da, we've been using it in production for a year, and it's great, and check it out. And this sort of apparently has happened with a number of new languages over the years, which to me, it seems like kind of bad advice because Elm has been by far our most successful recruiting tool. Like almost all of our new hires cite Elm as a reason for wanting to work for the company. It like really, really helps us stand out because there's a billion React shops out there. So I think they're kind of probably missing the boat, but at the same time, I'm also kind of like, well, more for us.
And most of the experience I've had with code bases that start out small and then they get larger too. Like you guys obviously started out small. You didn't have that many thousands to start with, right? So what are some of the challenges and the growing pains that you guys had that we could learn from?
Yeah, so for us, what we did was we just sort of, we started small. Evan wrote a blog post about sort of this approach to doing it called How to Use Elm at Work. It's on the elm-lang.org. And basically what we did was we just like rewrote one part of one page and in Elm, and then just kind of grew it from there. And we've been expanding ever since. As far as like growing pains, things to watch out for, I think most of the growing pains that we've had have been around the ops side because so like the language itself has been around for several years, but it hasn't seen like widespread production use for nearly as long. And so we've had to sort of like invent a lot of the tooling around deployments and stuff ourselves. And we've been open sourcing, as much as we can. But, it's just like one of those things where one of the great things about using a new language is that you become a more attractive place to work. People want to work on awesome technology. But on the flip side, it means that there's just like not a huge corpus of Stack Overflow answers to all of your questions. And so a lot of that stuff you just kind of have to figure out on your own, like kind of roll your own stuff. So definitely I would say like our growing pains, especially on the like ops and deployment side, have been sort of concentrated around there.
I just wanted to add about code bases. One of the bigger struggles I've found in both learning Elm and getting other people to learn it is there aren't that many examples of people using it for larger enterprisey apps, the kind of things where in the React community, you can just sort of hop in and see like a massive open source React app and how they structured things. And I made the mistake of thinking, hey, well, if that exists in the React community, the Elm community has to have something similar, right? Like there's got to be one way people build these big apps, right? There's got to be like a components folder and a distribution, and here's the way you package and build.
I just go to Richard's GitHub for that stuff.
Yeah, well, it turns out that's just sort of wrong. I mean, like the Elm architecture and the language itself is so helpful in guiding your app towards larger growth that you just figure out what works for you as you go. I mean, a good example of this when I've been going through other people's Elm apps is you notice some like of the architectural decisions that are really kind of unsolved in JavaScript or in React. They get all sorts of frameworks and libraries. You just don't have to worry about managing stuff like that. Like I'm going to build, the intro section of the resume, and then you know what? Like it might just so happen that I break out the types into another file, and okay, that worked for a while. Now it doesn't. It's getting clunky. I'll build something new. So growing an Elm code base is actually just an extremely pleasant experience. You're in this refactoring mindset that in another language would be nightmarish. You've got to re-architect the app in the middle of writing it while you're trying to get features out, and that's sad. And you want to get it right when you start. So that's why, these JavaScript communities put quite a lot of effort into getting it right at the start. Here's how you start your app and where everything should be laid out. But my experience with Elm has been, if you start with what you're trying to get done, and just as you encounter problems with the scaling of your own code and just sort of naturally bang them out, your app just grows wonderfully on its own. And it feels like magic, but it's not. It's a good type system. It's a good set of ideas. So I feel like I haven't seen a big Elm code base, but at the same time, I almost don't need to in a lot of ways. I feel like the language helps me enough.
Yeah, that's a great point. Something that I had to get used to was sort of like losing my fear of refactoring, because in JavaScript, like if I have a big code base, I'm like, okay, you need to reorganize this. You need to move these things over here and put these things over here and have these talk to each other in a different way. I'm like, oh no, like everything's gonna crash. Like I'm gonna have to rewrite a bunch of tests. Like I hope that like everything still works when the dust settles. And with Elm, I'm like, okay, like it's just not a thing that I worry about. And there are all these like weird like consequences that come from that, where it's just like all these things that are like really serious, important questions in JavaScript. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be. Like I mean, legitimately, they're legitimately, like difficult questions when that's what you're working with. They just stop being issues in Elm. And so then when people ask questions, they get weirded out by your answers. Like someone's like, how do you organize an Elm code base? Like, what does your file structure look like? I'm like, I don't really think it matters that much. Like, how could it not matter? Like, what if you need to change your file structure? Like, what if you pick the wrong one? What if you like decide later on that you need to have a totally different file structure? I'm like, that'd be fine. I don't know. Then I'd change it. What's the problem? And it's just so weird to like, I guess it's easy to forget that like you don't have that intuition on day one. You have to sort of build it up just by using it and sort of like realizing that you don't have to be afraid of those things anymore.
Yeah, I would
Isn't
say
that
that
disconnect
was,
tooling though. Like my problem is that I get what you're saying, and I enjoy that portion of it. But to some extent, that's a bit of a knowledge gap there, right? Because when I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, look, I've got to refactor this thing because the framework or the library or the thing that I need to use is not doing the thing that I want to do," to some extent, the thing that makes Elm nice is that you don't have to think about that because you're building code in a language and you're not relying necessarily on lots of bits and pieces that you're sort of piecemealing together. Because I see a lot of piecemeal. I see that all the time where, oh, look, we need to refactor this entire thing because we made a horrible architectural decision. Well, when did you make that architectural decision? A couple weeks ago. You made a horrible choice then. Like you didn't plan accordingly from an engineering standpoint to be able to go down that road. So I to some extent I see that I hear that well I hear about it like, oh, the language doesn't do X, and I question that. A lot of times I want to say it sounds to me like your framework doesn't do X and you don't know how to build Y.
I also want to point out the fact that like just that in some cases you don't get certain things in Elm means that you're writing better code. Like in a lot of cases, not having a feature means you're going to write stuff that's way easier to understand and maintain. And that's just when people, I had this exact, I can tell you the exact moment like my brain shifted from JavaScript-y framework development to sort of Elm development. And it was on our internal services dashboard. After talking to people, I realized that having a giant list of every service that's running and the status and the version and all these facts wasn't particularly useful. Turns out you don't need that much data. So I wanted to refactor that into just, what's wrong and everything else is fine. Here's some stats. So at first it seemed like a pretty daunting thing, and my intuition was to rewrite the components, and I was using components at the time in Elm, which was a little bit weird. Like I didn't realize that was kind of an anti-pattern. But in the middle of the refactor, like I just had this moment where I was like, screw it, I'm not going to try to get this right. Like I'm not going to focus on trying to make sure that I'm getting the perfect architecture here. I'm just going to slowly iterate on my current existing code until it comes out nice. And it turns out that if you just follow what the compiler is telling you you've broken, and naturally just put things together that are logically clumped, you end up with just good architecture and good code. And I can honestly say I've never been in a language where messing around just naturally leads you to a good solution. Normally when you mess around in a language, you're making a mess. And I don't feel like that's the case in these code bases I've been working on recently.
No, I think it is a very difficult thing in that regard, right? I mean, when you look, I mean, you know, hell is other people's code, right? I hear that from time to time, you know, pop up as you're looking at something that you're like, I don't understand that, you know, to the same extent, right? You know, why do we have to have little, you know, like the great left pad incident of all things, you know, why do I need this itty bitty line of code? Why didn't I just write this line of code? And you're talking to someone who believes heavily in the standard library set. But at the same time, you still have to have an understanding of
Elm standard library, incidentally. Has been for about 4 years. Anyway, sorry.
What was that?
No, but see, it is part of the standard sort of lib, as opposed to a piecemeal approach to sort of building sort of products that people are going to use. Because at the end of the day, someone's got to use it. And my problem with big refactors or languages that don't, or people who attack a language at the sort of really top level, where you're like, I'm using framework X, and I'm like, well, do you even understand what the thing underneath it does? Like, do you understand the language underneath? You know, I look at Elm, and I know we've had this conversation previously. You know, Elm is nice for that. Like, you don't necessarily have all of this unknown things that it does. And I don't like knowing things that, oh, look, I imported this. What does it do? I don't know. But it has this thing I need. I can't stand that, because then it puts doubt and possibly defects into my code base. I see a lot of, you know, you see that daily, you know, if you work in a lot of code bases. So it's nice to see things that don't necessarily lend themselves to that paradigm.
Yeah, so action that like I've asked you this before too, is like when you're dealing with Elm, like, and you're trying to scale it out to other groups, like once you're in startup mode, you can do Elm everything, right? But then you start getting larger as a company, and then you have other applications. Maybe the applications are built in Java, maybe some of them are built in Node, and some of them are built, you know, in other platforms. You have to communicate with some of these, you know, via microservices or whatever. I would imagine the integration is where it's hardest to do that, right? Using external libraries inside of Elm, like JavaScript libraries, because they're not built like Elm, where they understand, you know, there is no runtime errors, right? They still see the spoon.
Yeah, so the way Elm talks to JavaScript is essentially like a client-server relationship, which is to say that you don't directly call JavaScript functions. What happens is instead Elm just sends data out and then gets data back from JavaScript. So there's this sort of like strict separation where you sort of switch from Elm land to JavaScript land, much like you would switch from a client to a server. And so, yeah, then on the JavaScript side, JavaScript can go nuts. You can use whatever libraries you want, whatever whatever additional tools you want, tap into that enormous ecosystem. And then when you switch back to Elm, everything's great again, and you don't have to worry about runtime exceptions anymore. It is still technically possible, by the way, to get runtime exceptions in Elm. Like, of course, you can write a function that calls itself indefinitely, and that'll blow the stack. There's stuff you can do to crash Elm programs. But the point is that in practice, you don't really tend to see them. And obviously, we've gone so long without seeing them. Any day now, we could potentially have patient zero. We could finally have had our first runtime exception make it in production. But the fact that we've gone this long without it just kind of speaks to how well designed it is.
I wanted to add something.
That first sprint though, just waiting, is it gonna break or what?
You better have a fire extinguisher on the wall, just ready to go with some consolation prize to whoever causes the first Elm runtime exception at no red ink. because then you lose like one of your biggest talking points, and now you're gonna have to say, well, we had at least one runtime.
You know, it's funny at ElmConf at that speaker dinner, I went around and asked everybody. I was like, "Hey, those of you who are using it in production, how many total runtime exceptions have you gotten in production?" And I went around, and the total count for all the speakers at the ElmConf dinner was 0. So it's not just us. I don't know
So
about
you
you.
realize
Have
the
you guys?
stakes have been raised so high now that the first person who admits to having a run Elm time error, an Elm runtime error, is gonna become like some kind of pariah. Like, how did you even make this happen?
Well, let me ask you a question. So you guys have been using it. Have you hit any runtime exceptions in production yet?
Well, so on the stuff
So
that
yes.
happened, I will admit to one thing. JSON breaks my apps way more than I want it to, and that has been one of the bigger pain points I've found with Elm is interoperating with JSON directly. So it's not a runtime exception, but if something I wrote in my decoder is just bad, it didn't account for the JSON I made, which was also bad, well, then the thing is just going to say, so it's not a runtime exception. I'll hold myself to that standard. It was handled by the Elm code and rendered the proper error message, so there was no exception of any kind. The logical path happened that I had programmed in because I was forced to by the compiler. But still, that's been where some bugs come from, I guess. Just JSON parsing gets pretty gross if you don't be thoughtful about it, because it's just inherently like you've given people a data interchange format with stringly typed, field names, and you've got like JavaScript typing for the data itself. So you've invited all this terror into your beautiful little happy world, and it's been the only thing that's bitten me so far, honestly, in large scale.
Yeah, so this would be like where your server generates JSON that looks a certain way, and your front end code is expecting it to look a different way.
Exactly.
Important difference though between like the Elm and the JS experience, because obviously that same exact thing can happen, if you're using JS. But like you said, like with Elm, the way that you write code naturally leads you to give the end user a nice error message instead of just being like, oh, the page didn't come up. They have no information. Like you know when that happens, why that happens, and like kind of you're sort of naturally drawn to handling it in a nice way, or at least I am, because the compiler's like, hey, you need to account for this possibility that the JSON is not what we expected from the server. And so like it won't let you forget. You can choose to willfully disregard it and render a blank page anyway. You kind of almost have to go out of your way to ignore that that possibility.
Yeah, I can, from experience while working with in the dashboard rewrite we're doing, there's this giant, it was the service list page I was mentioning earlier. When I included in a type I made up to get this data back, it has the state of, here are all the things are coming eventually, and the things didn't come, here's why. And in that, the things didn't come, here's why, I used the HTTP error type. And in my view code, like, I just didn't handle an error. Like, I was starting to write my view code, blah, 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 and I just didn't take into account that possibility. So when I actually went to connect up my function that was pulling from the server to my view code, and then, oh, you've got this HTTP error type you aren't handling, dude, like, take care of that. Then naturally, my view code had to be adjusted to handle those errors. So I forgot about it, but was unable to. Right? Yeah, there's still compile errors. Like, I just started mocking out my view code with data I knew, like, I just had some mock data I was working with. I wanted to just get out a pretty display. But when I actually went to hook up my view code and the update function to the API calling section, it was like, hey, sir, like, you have all this stuff that could be happening you aren't handling right here. You've used an HTTP error type, so there are 4 possible things that are happening here that you aren't handling. Could have been a timeout, could have been bad payload, and you aren't handling any of those. So I need you to fix that before you move on. Like, that's important, sir. And having that assistant there is nice.
So how does, so it sounds like a lot of the at least what we're talking about right now, because that is I think one of the primary reasons a lot of apps break is things like that. It is data structures coming back that look different than you were expecting them. Like that, that just happens, and you have to account for them. So it sounds like one of the things that gives a lot of safety for some of that stuff in Elm is the type system. So how does something like Elm's type system differ from something like TypeScript's type system, or even Flow or something like that? So how is it? So if that is one of the big parts, why would writing it in TypeScript not be just as safe as writing it in Elm?
Any. So in TypeScript and Flow, you have an any type, which is an escape hatch, which ruins everything. Elm does not have any. There is no escape hatch.
I would just also posit that one of the fundamental differences between the two kinds of type systems is that one is written for humans and the other is written for computers. I want a type system that was designed to make me a better programmer, not a type system that is designed to make my code understandable to more code. I feel like that should be automated for me. Like, I don't want to have to tell the computer what kind of data I'm working with, insofar as it helps me. Like, that's not my concern up until the moment it could bite me. So the Elm type system gives you powerful tools that you enjoy using. They're not just required, but I can't imagine working without them. They're fundamental things I reach for and use as problem-solving mechanisms, whereas in other languages with types like Java or TypeScript, they're not so much problem-solving tools as they are like a very thin set of bumpers you use to guide your code into making certain kinds of exceptions not as relevant. They don't really provide the kind of amazing developer experience you get when you start using these higher order type things. And at first they're scary to people. They really don't like that concept. I've come across of like writing an enum type for some reason has been kind of like a mind-blowing moment every time I've taught it. But when you sort of internalize what that enum type gives you in terms of powers, you feel like you just gained seriously a supernatural talent. So I don't know, the fundamental difference to me is feelings. The Elm type system makes me feel like a better programmer.
That's awesome.
I just feel kind of gross when I use the other one, I guess.
I think there's a difference. Like, type system is one way to look at it, but there's also just like sort of the API ecosystem, right? So like JavaScript in a lot of cases. So the whole reason that like TypeScript and Flow need any, like if you read the docs, it's like this is a way that you can sort of gradually introduce a type system and sort of opt out of it when you want to. Elm is saying there is no opting out. The whole Elm ecosystem, everything buys into this approach. It's all like everybody's on the same page. We're all rowing in the same direction. Like every API you use that like is literally a .elm file is built in this way from the ground up. And actually this extends to the package ecosystem. So if you use Elm package, so Elm has its own package manager. And once again, the package manager is aware of all this, right? It's like baked right in. And one of the things that gives it is enforced semantic versioning. So actually, if you try to publish an Elm package that makes a breaking API change, like you change the type of something or you like take out a function and you try to publish that as a minor change, that'll get automatically rejected. It'll say you have to bump the major version number for that because we know that your code is typed using Elm's type checker, and we saw what you did there, and that's a major change. You need to conform to this standard. And it's like NPM just cannot ever have that, right? That's not something you could do in NPM because, you know, even if NPM went totally TypeScript, you would still have the any type just hanging out there saying, oh, well, okay, sometimes this is true and sometimes it's not. Like Elm gets a lot of its user experience benefits from the fact that everything buys into this approach.
It's kind of strange because like I'm torn. I really love the flexibility that JavaScript provides, but at the same time, you know, if you use something like Elm, you don't have to worry about a whole bunch of other things.
I just have one
thing. It's going to help you ship faster.
Throw in there about flexibility. It's a trap. So you get flexibility with Elm. You do. It's there. It's able for you to use in any way you can design it, but it's flexibility that is accounted for. When you start introducing flexibility and complexity that isn't accounted for, it's unchecked. That's when you start running into issues with your code. And for me, functional programming in general really is about transforming sets of data, right? Like when you're working with Elm code or any other functional language, you are moving data around from one kind of thing to another, growing it, like you're doing things to data. And when you talk about like the Elm type system, it makes sure that those transformations handle every possible case or path the data could go down. So you're building a set of pipelines essentially that must be accounted for. And if you don't have that type system there, you are inherently accepting the fact that at some points in your program, you are introducing a data flow which may not have a correct output. It's just unknown. You can't guarantee that all the data will correctly arrive at the destinations you were choosing. And so that becomes super important when you're talking about, especially what I was mentioning earlier, like you start at API level code and you have an HTTP error, well, that eventually transforms down into HTML people view. So in that transformation path, there's errors that could happen. The data could become an error, and you have to transform that into the error HTML. And the type system, although it is strict, forces you to account for those things. And when you stop thinking about those paths that you think you get when you start being flexible, then it's not really a feature anymore. It just becomes a giant mass of worry and unknowns that aren't handled for you anymore. So, the Elm type system is what creates these pipelines. It's not magic. Like when people talk about no runtime errors, it's not because there's some magical thing Elm is doing that nobody else can do. It's because Elm forces you to think about states that the flexibility of other languages leave you free to forget.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really gets to me, though, is if you have a bunch of JavaScript developers and you want to teach them Elm, right, there is a little overhead to that, teaching them any new language, right? But if I give them TypeScript, there is some to learn, but you can just write JavaScript and not even use types if you wanted to, and still use TypeScript. So I guess it depends on, the team you have. If you have a team of polyglots, that's going to go a lot faster, right? Because they know maybe Ruby or they know some Go or some other language as well to pick up Elm, especially if they know something like Haskell. I'm sure to pick up Elm would be a lot faster.
I have one kind of random question tied back to you were talking about the any type in TypeScript or anything else, because you can, and I'm not going to say that I've never done this, but TypeScript has typecasting as well. So you can, and one of the reasons it's there is kind of for backwards compatibility stuff. If you want to use a JavaScript library that does not have types in it, you can bring something in and cast it to an any type so that it will, so that your compiler won't break. Does Elm have anything? Does Elm have typecasting?
Nope.
No typecasting at all. Yeah. So you're exactly right. There is no way for you to manually introduce those errors, because I mean you do have to work, like in something like TypeScript, you do have to work around them, because the compiler is trying not to let you do that. But it does. But you're talking about any, it is there for a reason. And I know I'm not the only one that was like, I don't want to write. I haven't written the interface for this yet. I'm just going to say this is any, and then I never go back and I never, even if I write the interface, I then don't go back and update it.
Right. So that's exactly why Elm has this sort of client-server relationship, right? It's like the idea is that sending data out and then getting data back is sort of a well-understood problem. It's like something you do when talking to servers all the time, and we know that we can do that in a way where at least it won't crash. We might get something surprising. And obviously, crashes can still happen in whatever JavaScript code you're calling out to. There's no, like, Elm can't affect the JavaScript code that somebody else wrote. But at least you can say, like, okay, if we get malformed data back, we can handle that gracefully. And when we send data out, obviously it's like the JavaScript code's responsibility to handle that properly. But yeah, it's like the whole idea is to sort of say, okay, we know where this boundary is. Right here at this point of communication, that's the only place where these errors can happen. The scary stuff about typecasting is that something can sneak into your code, right? And it can sort of infiltrate and like not happen right there, but rather happen in some completely seemingly unrelated part. And the difference is that in Elm, you're like, okay, right here at this border, right here at this point of communication, we need to focus really hard on getting that right. Like Conner was saying earlier, like do your error handling there and make sure that you can give the user a graceful degradation if something goes wrong. As opposed to suddenly you can't trust any part of your code base if you're doing that, right? That any could mean that like it sneaks through and it's totally fine here, but then in this one corner case, like in some completely seemingly unrelated part of your code base, that's where the problem happens. So not having to worry about that and being able to have this just high degree of trust and like once you're in Elm land, like all of your Elm code plays by these same set of rules that are really reliable. That's what makes people talk about the sort of joy of programming in Elm, is just being able to just work in that environment and spend so much of your time in that environment, and then only having to shift mindset and be like, okay, hang on, now I need to get really defensive at these points of communication. It's pretty nice.
I have one other question tied to that, and then I promise I'll stop and we can move on. So one of the other things that I'm actually curious about is the other way, and TypeScript is the example we're using, and I think it's a fairly apt. They're not the same, but they're like, it's two technically different languages that with a type system. Is it possible to build a JavaScript library in Elm? So for example, RX, the new RxJS is written in TypeScript, but it compiles down to JavaScript code, and then you can pull the JavaScript code in and use it you don't have to use TypeScript to use it. Is it possible to do something like that with Elm? Or it's like, once you're in Elm, that's where you live?
It's possible, but I wouldn't do it. Because basically, Elm is designed for building applications, and Elm libraries are designed to support Elm applications. You could go the other way around, but I think that honestly, the overhead would not be worth it. Personally.
Okay, that's a totally fair answer, and kind of what I was expecting.
It's pretty true as well that when you're working with Elm, the more power you give to Elm, the happier you're going to be. There's a direct correlation between the two.
Conner, I demand you say something bad about Elm.
I seriously can't. It's a problem. So I've been thinking about this a lot too. Like, if I find myself talking about Elm for too long, I get almost zealous, and that hasn't happened to me in a long time. Like, the last technology I can remember being like this just bubbly about, I guess, was like learning HTML. Like way back in the day when I went from back-endy stuff to, wow, the web is a thing, and look how pretty I can make stuff. So yeah, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but it's got like supplements in it that makes you a better programmer, it feels like. So I don't know. I definitely can talk a lot about it, but I think it's got practical and objective like reasons for it. Like, I don't feel like I'm just hyped because I am hyped. It's neat and shiny. I feel hyped because for the first time in a long time, I've cared about the front end again. I used to be so distracted by everything the front end had to offer and doing it correctly, and the entire space was confusing enough that I just stayed away from it. But this is like a very surefire way I found back into caring about front end stuff. So for me, it's like had a huge impact in just my day job. And potential opportunities to me as a developer, I went from someone who was mostly concerned with what's happening behind a page to now the most fun part of the app is the page itself. And that experience has been quite delightful. So,
which is interesting because you have a lot of knowledge and skill in the front end using JavaScript, CSS, and HTML.
I do. I've been bouncing all over the place, and now I'm doing DevOps stuff. So you really never know where the world's going to take you. And in this case, like, I'm being taken along by Elm back to the front end, and maybe might be doing game dev stuff with it again. Who knows? Like, that's a potential thing now.
You can go pair with Danny and do some VR games.
I could say something bad about Elm that actually has to do with the name of this podcast, the web platform, which is to say that Elm doesn't cover all of it yet. Elm's philosophy is to say, like, we're not just going to kick down to the native JavaScript APIs. We're actually going to go through and like present each of these web platform capabilities in an API that makes sense for Elm. But that means that, that takes time. The web platform is, listeners may be shocked to learn, large. There's a lot of stuff there. So I used IndexedDB, for example, on a big project in the past, and like Elm just does not have an IndexedDB API. So like all of that stuff is like, I'm just using JS interop. Like I had to write all of the, talking to IndexedDB logic in JavaScript. That's not my first choice, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, I think, like overall that's the right approach, even if today that doesn't make me the happiest. But yeah, I mean, it is a drawback to think about, right? It's still a relatively young language. Like not everything is there yet.
So, but that also makes sense. With the fact that no, it doesn't provide the direct API, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it. You can do it. You just have to jump through a couple hoops. And I just think that's important. That is important to bring up you don't have to wait for Elm to support something in the web platform if you want to use it and they don't support it. It's just nicer when they do.
Well, to that point though, rather than having everybody rewrite the IndexedDB for their apps, right? what is the process to get that into Elm proper, or even like userland, some sort of module, for lack of a better term?
Essentially, well, the main thing to note about the process is, and actually so Evan, his keynote at ElmConf talks about both this as well as circling way back to the like time travel. At the end of his talk, he demos the version of like the time travel debugger that's coming out in the next release. That's sort of geared around like not just being a flashy demo, but actually just like how do people want to debug Elm applications, and like making it as useful as possible for that, including import export. Like that's like the coolest part. Is just like your QA person can run like your code. They can be like, oh, I found a bug, and just like literally press a button and it exports a CSV they can send to the developer, and the developer can just import, and now you just reproduced exactly what they did, including time travel. And you can just like literally walk back and just watch every step that they took. And then of course you can fix the bug, start it up again, import it again, and replay it. And unless the fix was too invasive where replay is disabled, then you can actually just watch it get fixed and confirm that they would no longer be able to reproduce it by doing what they did. But that was a bit of a tangent. To your question about what's the process for like IndexedDB, say like getting that out there. So as far as like direct contributions, so like if you want to put it on Elm package, well, you can't do that as a community member because Elm package is all Elm files, and kind of the whole problem here is that like you can't write Elm code to do this yet. But as far as the community process around like getting that in, basically it's lots and lots of discussion. So before something goes into like the Elm core, like becomes part of the platform that everybody gets, part of the way that the quality bar gets maintained is that it's sort of this philosophy of like, don't rush to get it out there the nice way. Like, let's focus on making the nice way nice. In the meantime, you don't have to be blocked. You can just like work around it. Just use, like worst case scenario, you can write less Elm code and more JavaScript, right? Like JavaScript's still there. It all still works. But as far as like how should the real thing look, like every time if you look through like the mailing list and stuff like that, it's always the same process, which is just like, okay, let's think about use cases. How do people want to use this thing? What do people want to do with this? What are the things we need to worry about? What are the ways that this could go wrong? Let's throw out several different draft APIs. Let's talk about them. What are the pros and cons? What do other languages do? What do other frameworks do? What do other libraries do? And just sort of really put all the options out there and discuss them so that once you finally settled on an API that seems like it makes sense and it's going to be nice to use, you can actually sort of like trace back and say, oh, here's all the decisions that made to this. Here are the trade-offs that we're making so that like the end result is actually nice. So fortunately, that's an area where like community involvement is not only like encouraged, but really important. Like just getting in there and saying, here's how I want to use IndexedDB. Here are the things that are important to me. Here are the things I need to worry about. And so when somebody proposes, hey, it looks like we don't need to like worry about this particular thing because it's going to be caught by something else. Can anybody who's part of this discussion come up with a counterexample? Can anyone think of something that we're overlooking? And so community participation in API design is actually really important.
So I was thinking, and I do have something bad to say about Elm.
Yay!
Yay! So it's very foreign, and it basically comes down to when looking at technologies and when looking at what you're using to make your front end and to get problems solved. For a lot of people, the amount of new stuff will be a lot. For instance, using some of the most popular APIs like JSON decode require pretty good knowledge of how both the type system works and functional composition works in general. And what I found as being by far my biggest struggle with Elm itself really doesn't involve the language or the framework. It involves getting an entire paradigm that's in people's brains to switch to something new. And in a lot of cases, and for a lot of companies, that switch is going to be such a large cost that they won't see the benefits that Elm provides as being worth it. Now, I would argue that, I've bought into the functional programming sort of mindset, but for some people, we do have to admit, like, that's just a lot to take on when you're trying to deliver web applications. And they just won't make that leap. So you end up, like in my office, at least, I've sort of become the functional guy because, this Elm stuff is so different and so strange to people that it does bring with it a kind of like a scary, ominous, this is a lot to learn. There's some fundamentals here that you just don't know anymore. Things that you knew from your programming bag of tricks in JavaScript world, imperative world, they just aren't in your new bag. They are nowhere to be found, but they're different things. And sometimes that difference can be so big it pushes people away. Now, I would say that with more people in the community, as we find out how people learn Elm, that transition will become much easier. There's already, obviously Richard has written a book on this, that's going to help. Everything in this, everyone who's using it and going through the effort to make learning easier will ease that problem in the future. But for right now, that tends to be such a pretty big thing for me. Just that Elm is foreign enough to cause problems just because of how different it is. And I hope the ideas inside Elm will eventually become like the normal ideas people use while programming these kinds of applications, but for the time being, it's not. So there's a pretty big mental shift that has to occur to be productive.
I think anything that you integrate in any organization that is relatively new, regardless of how it generally looks, is a big thought process shift anyhow. I mean, the problem is that a lot of people try to go in and say, hey, let's just replace things. Let's go and start integrating stuff. And it's really a poor approach. You're taking productive people and then making them instantly unproductive because you didn't take the steps to sort of guide them into this thing. You didn't have, hey, let's test this as a small scale on something greenfield. Oh, hey, let's do a little integration to start to see how it works. Oh, okay, now let's build a bigger piece of this other puzzle that we're building. There's so much shift now because people just love, that sort of new shiny thing that people are talking about. And I don't know why this occurs more now than it used to. Mind you, I'm old, so I remember things that no one else remembers, but I don't quite understand it. I see a lot of it where oh, we've completely changed the entire thing out for this. Wow, everyone in your office knows that?
Software life cycles have gotten much faster than
they were.
But
I think also afraid of the abacus.
Well, yes, I like my abacus very much. No, even with software life cycles have always been pretty short. I even for the stuff that wasn't web-based that I used to work on way long time ago, the life cycles were short. You had to spin up new things. You had to keep shipping features that users wanted. But you didn't abandon your base. When new things came, you integrated them. You had a plan. You just didn't drop and go. And so, for things like Elm, which can have incredible value, you don't have to drop everything you're doing and say, you know what, we're all now Elm all the time.
I would say, though, it's a definite mistake to realize or to think that, this kind of context shift, software development life cycles are short. People do iterate on these technologies. But specifically in the case of Elm, the kind of shift in the thing you're asking for isn't a new framework like the transition from Angular to React or something like that. It's a much larger, grander shift in thinking. And it is very costly in both terms of your immediate upfront cost and just the feeling of comfortableness you've developed in your entire development career prior to that. But I think as more and more people try it and test it and just see how it works for them, they'll discover that those upfront costs are eventually outweighed by the feeling of loving web development again. And those short development life cycles you see in JavaScript, I think are really going to help push people towards things like Elm. I don't know if Elm is the final answer to how we're going to do front-end development, but it sure as heck is one that's kept me on board longer than any other technology in the past. So there is that cost. I think people, and especially big organizations, are slow to adopt that sort of thing. But I have a lot of hope for the slow realization of the benefits involved,
To love web development once again.
Yeah.
All right, so we're over time. Thank you guys for staying a little bit later. If people want to find you, harass you on Twitter, go to your GitHub or whatever. Where can people find you, Richard?
Yeah, RT Feldman on both Twitter and GitHub. Also, I guess you can now, well, okay, not quite yet because it's not out yet, but I just did a 2-day front-end master's course on Elm. So people will be able to find that. Hopefully it's like 16-ish hours of start to finish, like assuming no Elm knowledge and going all the way through. So depending on when you're listening to this.
Those workshops are high quality too.
Well, the others are, but also mine is there. So
yes,
yeah, that's another way people can find me. And of course, yeah, the book Elm in Action from Manning Publications, currently available from Meep.
All right, and Conner?
I'm sort of an internet lurker when it comes to these things. I don't really have that much of a social media presence. This is my first podcast, but I love working on code with people. So if you are better than me, like, I'd love to work with you so, I can learn some new stuff. And if you want some help in what you're working on, I'd love to do that too. I hang out on the Slack channel for Elm all the time. I definitely read it way too much at work, but it's such an exciting place to be. Just join Elm Slack. I'm in there pretty often. I guess that's probably the best way, but if you go there, you'll just have fun in general. So,
and thank you for the work you're doing here at Carfax for us as well. I hope one day we'll be able to open source some of it.
We're gonna have to. It's I don't think I'm gonna be able to contain my excitement as you. We went over time because I probably was talking too much.
Oh, you're excited. That's awesome.
No, it's fun. It's great.
So, well, thank you guys.
Seems to have that effect on people.
It's a serious problem. Productivity.
I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
It's a great problem to have.
Yeah, we can't stop talking about our language. Oh my God.
Well, it's been a great show. Thank you guys so much. It's been episode number 108, Elm Revisited. And we'll see you guys next week.
Bye, everybody.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at Plus the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.